how to accommodate those dreams and visions and hopes. So I thought just to root us in the realities of northern Uganda, and to remember why we're here, I just take a little snippet of one of the interviews of one of the kids that I met in kind of going around and doing these surveys over the last month, and it's just a random one we picked out that can get us going here. So if they can hit the videotape. You know this guy? Who's this guy?
Yeah.
What's your name?
My name is Steven.
Steven?
Yeah.
Okay, how old are you, Steven?
I'm fine.
You know this guy here?
Yeah.
You ever seen each other before?
Yeah, I've seen it.
Okay. And where are you from, Steven?
I'm from St. Maurice.
Where's that?
Just down there.
How far is that? Far away?
Far. About 1 mile.
About a mile. So you come here every night?
I come here at night, I sleep here. And then at the morning time, I go back home.
Why are you sleeping here?
This is due to other problems. That is, our brothers, those one in the bush community.
But what do you think might happen to you if you stayed at home tonight?
Abduction, fortunately, it happens.
They would come and take you?
Yeah.
Have you
They come and take you, and when you fail to move with them, why do you carry their things?
Yeah.
Food stuffs, what? The moment you fail to carry them,
yeah.
Fortunately you die. They just kill you.
They just kill you for that?
Yeah.
My God.
And during the time of, if these soldiers are trying to rescue you,
yeah.
Fortunately, these bullets, it's also what? It also damage the people. See?
Even when they're trying to rescue you,
yeah,
they might hit you with the bullet.
Yeah.
I see. Wow. Hey, listen. So are you going to school during the day?
Yeah, we go.
You go to school?
Yeah. Now we are in all this.
Yeah. What do you want to do when you get older? What you hope to be when you grow up?
My expectation
yeah.
is to be. I would like to be a doctor.
Really?
Yeah.
So you on what now?
I'm senior 1.
Senior 1. Wow, that's exciting. And so you got the school fees?
There's no school fees, but my parents are trying to struggle because I'm an orphan.
Because you're an orphan?
Yeah. So my grandmom is trying to struggle.
What happened to your mom and dad?
Fortunately, they died.
How did they die?
These problems, these people, the moment my mom went to the village,
yeah.
So during the time she was coming back, the car was shot. And unfortunately, she died.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And what happened to your father?
My father was sickness.
Okay.
Yeah, he was sick, then he died.
And what about, you got, how many brothers you got?
I have 2 brothers.
How about sisters?
1 sister.
Do they come tonight here, or where do they go at night to sleep?
The problem with my sisters, one, my aunt went with her.
Yeah.
She's in Kampala.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And what about your brothers? Where do they go?
They are here.
In the camp? I mean, inside this, where you're going to sleep tonight?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of them is here.
Yeah? And what time do you get up tomorrow morning to leave?
At about 7:30.
Okay. Get back to your schooling. When you go to school, when you get into the secondary school, how are you going to be able to afford to, how many years is it? 3 or 4?
6 years.
6 years of secondary school?
Yeah.
Do you think you'll be able to afford it?
Under God's wills.
Okay. And what do you got there in your hand? You got a book there. What's the book?
This one is a dictionary.
What are you studying?
This one is a perfect dictionary company. It contains terms of English, biological terms.
Oh, I see. Because you want that to go to medical school, so you need to study the science. Is that it?
Yeah.
Man, you're getting an early start. I like that. Okay, that's cool. Why don't you got an address? Do you have an address?
No address.
Okay. Where do you live? Tell me the name of the town again. The displaced camp you're living.
Yes, it's called St. Maurice.
St. Maurice. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. My friend, it was very nice to meet you.
Okay, fine.
Okay, you take care.
Yeah.
All right? See you again, okay? Are you... There's stories and stories and stories like this. You just, I mean, it's overwhelming. You know, every night going into these centers and thousands of kids, you see them streaming into the towns in the Kikimagulu at night. It's like a whole different country. From if you spend your time in Kampala, which is an extraordinary metropolis and a robust, growing place, northern Uganda is a whole other world, as those of you who have been there know. Well, greetings to all of you, particularly to Ambassador Sampala. Thank you for coming. I started working on African conflicts 2 decades ago, and over the last 20 years, one of the most intractable conflicts during that time has been, in the world, has been the conflict in northern Uganda. And having watched this predatory insurgency metastasize over those 2 decades, and particularly during the last 10 years with Sudanese government support, I wasn't sure the day would ever arrive that I could say with some confidence that peace is possible in northern Uganda. But I think that day has arrived. All the elements are in place now for a deal to come together. Rebel demands are becoming clearer and clearer as time goes on. The government has expressed flexibility. President Museveni himself, to me, in a very long discussion just a couple of weeks ago, has expressed a great deal of flexibility regarding the demands that the rebels have. The military position of the rebels is becoming more and more tenuous because of a number of factors, and as we know, Sudanese support is dwindling. However, there's always a however with these kinds of things. The frustrating reality is that despite these very interesting and important windows of opportunity, no real process has yet emerged, despite the best efforts of Betty Bigambe. The LRA has now lost its ability to communicate while it's in southern Sudan because its satellite phone has been damaged. And efforts to kind of reestablish regular and reliable communication have not yet succeeded at this very tender juncture in the effort to establish a process. And with the likelihood of arrest warrants coming down the pike by the ICC in the near future, and patience wearing thin on all sides, we really need, in the very near future, for the LRA to commit to a specific process with an end game that's clearly definable. In the absence of that, there may be no peace process that unfolds and no peace deal that becomes possible for 2005. During April, there was a great deal of positive energy there. Joseph Kony, the LRA leader, had the most comprehensive set of discussions that he had ever had since the war began with Betty Bigambe. In mid-April, he was actually ready to meet. He indicated a date and a time. He also indicated his willingness to go on air on Radio Omega, the main station in the north, to announce his commitment to a process, to announce that he would be willing to cease hostilities. However, a number of logistical and political problems, like always happen in these situations, undermined both of these efforts, and they never happened. And we can talk about those in a minute. Shortly thereafter, after this disappointing set of events that led to an inability to capitalize on the willingness on the part of Kony to take a step forward, then that's when the satellite phone was damaged. Communication was cut for almost a month, going from mid-April to mid-May, late May actually, and it's been very difficult to reestablish communication. The communication now is much more irregular. It's very hit and miss. Vincent O.T. calls occasionally to Betty, say, "Hey, we're still in it. We still want to get involved in this mediation. We got a problem communicating. Blah blah blah." It's really unclear as to whether they're just playing games or whether there actually is a serious problem of communication out there, because they are on the run. So I think it's time now, we've talked a lot about this in the last couple of days, it's time now for the mediation to establish a very clear next step, a meeting of some kind, backed by the same security guarantees that were in place earlier when Sam Kolo met with Betty Bigambe, that will demonstrate, almost basically put forth a test as to whether or not the LRA is serious about engaging in a real peace process in Uganda. We're at this sort of fork in the road that if one fork is taken, we could really, I think, close down a deal by the end of the year. If the other step is taken, which is disengagement in the communication effort by the LRA, then I think that the only options left then are the military and judicial ones. Now, Kony himself perceives his fate to lie in either prison, death, or exile. Those are the choices that he feels he has. A peace deal, I think, could give him a fourth option, a protected future inside Uganda. And he has a chance at such an exit strategy now, but only if he negotiates such an arrangement for himself and his commanders. The government remains ready to deal, I think. The ball is largely in Joseph Kony's court. So I want to tell you today what I think are the real opportunities, the golden opportunities that exist now in the peace process, why the context is ripe for potential resolution, as they say here in Washington. The first one is the trends that exist within the LRA itself. I think in response to the kind of military progress that the UPDF, the Ugandan military, has made during the last year, and the reduced support on the flip side from Sudan to the LRA due to the protocol between the governments of Uganda and Sudan. And you couple those military developments with the pressure that the International Criminal Court investigations have placed on the LRA. We're seeing their military capacity slowly erode. The LRA is increasingly a loser in a war of attrition in which its force levels are getting smaller and smaller by the week. The LRA is losing 3 to 5 fighters a day through combat casualties or capture or defections, with a vastly weakened capacity to regenerate, principally because it's unable to abduct the number of people that it used to be able to. And because of this reduced number, the LRA is becoming more officer heavy as its rank and file shrinks daily. The LRA commanders that I interviewed, and I spent much of my time over the last month with commanders who have come out and rank and file who have come out recently for whatever reason, whether they're captured, whether they leave voluntarily, whether they come by a peaceful means or in the context of combat. These commanders, to a man, have said that it is now a moment of opportunity to strike a deal with the LRA. And I just give you their words from a couple of different ones who have up till very recently been associated directly with Joseph Kony. One of them told me, quote, "The material condition of LRA commanders has deteriorated 100% over the last year. We've lost a lot. Most commanders are willing to negotiate because of this. If the government could give the LRA a quarter or a half of what it wants, what the LRA wants, we may as well take it." Now, another one told me the following, another quote, "We have lost so much. We are seeing fellow commanders being killed. At home, people are dying. Many in the LRA want to come back to rescue the situation for the people in the north." So we have opportunities here that are ripe. The second set of opportunities, I think, reside directly in the sort of the mindset and the calculations of Joseph Kony himself, which we all, of course, only have windows into, this very complex character. Now, it could very well be an elaborate effort to create breathing space for for the LRA at this point because of the military fortunes which are ebbing. But nevertheless, the opening that he did provide by virtue of this regular communication that began in April with Betty, this opening has to be pursued, I think, aggressively in the short term to see if there is any seriousness on the part of the LRA on the part of Kony himself to close a deal. Now, from my discussions with LRA officials during the last month, a number of, I think, tentative insights can be gleaned into where Kony is at this time. By all accounts, he is very interested in a peace deal and what the ramifications of that would be. And he asked lots of questions about what would happen, what would happen to him, what would happen to the other commanders, where they would end up. His main concern is his fear for his own security, and it's on 4 levels. The first level is the ICC, of course, the concern that he will be hunted forever as a result of any kind of arrest warrant that would be issued in the future. The second is the U.S. terrorism list. He's very unclear about, as many people are in northern Uganda, about what the U.S. intention ultimately is. If we would indeed, if there was an agreement struck, if the U.S. would accept that agreement or whether it would continue to pursue him because he is on the terrorism list and the U.S. government's terrorism list. The third level of concern is the Ugandan government itself, that perhaps that they would bait him into the thing, into a deal, and then switch on him and prosecute him or kill him. And then fourth is his fear of local community retribution. So many of these officers are concerned about the fact that they've got so much blood on their hands that the potential for retribution from the communities that have bled because of their atrocities would be the ones that ultimately would go after them and the ones that they're most concerned about. Now, at one point in mid-April, Kony, when he was initially having these very intensive discussions with Betty Bugamba, he was willing, or he said he was willing, to sign some form of a ceasefire within the next 2 weeks, which would have been the last 2 weeks of April. This is the same time that he said that he would be willing to have an actual meeting with Betty. Another interesting insight, true or not, dissemblance or not, he said, of course we all know for years whatever little bit of political ideology that exists that bleeds out of the LRA every once in a while is largely simply a rejection of the current governing structure. But he's told interlocutors that he's not opposed to a third term for the president, so fairly bizarre twist of the tale here. He's also said he's very worried that the government would not implement any deal that he might sign. He's cited a number of other deals that have gone south, or at least have not been fully implemented, as reasons why he is uneasy, such as Cote d'Ivoire and Congo, neighboring Democratic Republic of the Congo. So these disparate accounts, and there are many, many more, indicate that Kony isn't necessarily the madman that he's often made out to be, but rather that he's clearly manic in terms of his very wild swings in his moods, and he's undoubtedly a very sadistic human being. But he's clearly taking this latest effort at peacemaking with the LRA very seriously. During April and into May, he asked to make contact with his family members who are not in LRA areas or not in southern Sudan. They're in urban centers in Uganda, people that he had lost contact with, including some of his wives, his sister, and his brother. And he had discussed with them now during this last couple of months his own personal security. He's discussed the seriousness of the government in the peace process. He's discussed how he can get all his children into school. So he has some very specific concerns that would not be necessarily the concerns of a person that has no interest in coming out. The most intriguing lost opportunity was in mid-April, 17th of April, when Kony told Betty Bugamba that he would be willing to meet with her, and he established a location and a date and a time that he would meet. Now, because of the short time, it was a couple of days after that he was he was saying that he would be in position to meet. Because of short time frame, because of logistical and security obstacles, they weren't able to have that meeting. He wanted to talk about the modalities of the ceasefire proposal that the government has put forward, specifically, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the assembly areas that is the main point of concern or contention that the LRA has. Very disappointing possibility that ultimately didn't happen. Another opportunity arose, as I mentioned earlier, in mid-April when he agreed to appear or to come on to Radio Mega and announce his commitment to the peace process and announce some kind of unilateral cessation of hostilities. This is what he said he was going to do. At first, the government denied him access to the airways, which because of terrorism laws, they don't let him speak. But then they reversed that position, said it was okay, he could do it. Now, one of the many weird, strange things about Joseph Kony is when he says he's going to do something at a particular time, he does it at the exact moment that he says he's going to do it. Who knows where that comes from, but that's what he did. So he called, actually, the Radio Mega at the preordained time. Nobody takes this stuff seriously, so they weren't ready. They didn't have the equipment in place. They weren't able to put him on air to air his message as soon as they didn't have it in place right at that moment. He hung up, and that was it. These two gestures, I think, the proposed meeting and the offer to make the radio broadcast, are small but potentially important signals, potentially, that some kind of process is possible with Kony if it's handled correctly. More concrete action we clearly need very soon to demonstrate whether this hypothesis has any validity. Now, the third, of course, opportunity that exists now is as a result of the diminished support from Sudan. We all know that certainly that Sudan has reduced significantly. Some people believe they've ended, some reduced significantly the support for the LRA. And Bashir met with Defense Minister Mbabazi just last month to, as part of the discussions regarding the continuation of the protocol between the two countries in dealing with security issues. And Bashir told the minister that these LRA attacks in southern Sudan were unacceptable and were leading Khartoum to wanting to enhance its cooperation with the Ugandan government in order to remove the LRA as a problem to everyone. Now, we all know that the Sudanese government, one of their pawns in their chess game in southern Sudan is to use the LRA, so you can't take these words at face value. But there certainly is increasing frustration on the part of the Sudanese government as to the kind of out-of-control nature of attacks by the LRA, not only on civilians but also on Sudanese government military installations, mostly to resupply themselves for weapons and artillery. So the Sudanese and Ugandan militaries are going to meet soon and start a process to map out the plan to deal decisively with the LRA. We'll see soon whether the Sudanese are serious about this. It could be influenced greatly by the ascension of the SPLM into the government next month. But certainly there is a commitment now from Bashir that liaison officers from both armies can be deployed to the areas of operation for coordination purposes, particularly in Juba and Nitze. If there was more international community pressure on Sudan on this issue, I think the coordination mechanism that's being established could actually make a difference in the field. Now, getting on to solutions and how to take this to the next level, there are many elements that need to be involved in a comprehensive peace strategy in northern Uganda. We don't have time today to talk about the whole picture, and I want to just, since we've talked a lot about the mediation effort, I want to kind of focus on that, the element of mediation in the overall effort to bring peace and stabilization and normalization to northern Uganda. I'm going to talk about the immediate issue of the ceasefire interactions around the ceasefire, and then the larger question of the end game. First, on the ceasefire, the main sticking point that exists now on the LRA side has been the question of assembly points. Coney and other commanders believe that the government has proposed areas that are too small and too exposed for the LRA to accept. They would leave the rank and file that are in these areas as sort of sitting ducks if the cessation of hostilities were to abruptly terminate. Now, President Museveni has responded to this sort of to this point in directly in discussion with me and with others as being very open to discussion and amendment of this proposal. The key is that the LRA has to make its position clear. We need them to say, okay, this is specifically what we would like as part of this assembly area, and then you can start to horse trade and about the size, the location, should it be on the border, so they basically have an escape route into Sudan, or should it not be? How wide should these areas be, and where along the border should they be located? These are basically negotiable positions. Again, we're tantalizingly close to having a deal where there's flexibility on both sides. It's just getting a mechanism to have that deal struck. Secondly, and more importantly, of course, is the end game, is where is this all going? And I think laying out the end game, where the government particularly sees the future, would be essential to convince the LRA that they stand to actually benefit from a comprehensive peace. So parallel to the ceasefire discussion, which has to happen just to build some confidence, work needs to begin now more in depth on the draft package that the government of Uganda would present to the LRA on security arrangements and on the livelihood opportunities, which are the two main issues that would comprise any negotiated solution. We've written a lot about that in the last couple of reports that ICG has done, but those are the two main issues. I mean, these guys, I said to you earlier, Coney and all the commanders are obsessed about security, so that would be by far and away the most substantive issue that would be dealt with in a negotiations process. And then secondly would be, where do they all end up? How will they make a living? Not just the commanders, but also the rank and file. These are really all that has to be addressed in a deal. And I think that by putting forth some ideas, whether it's an international proposal, whether it's Betty's proposal, whether it's the government of Uganda's proposal, wherever it comes from, just putting some ideas on the virtual table will lead the LRA to come back with some ideas if they're serious about, at the end of the day, we can't force them into a peace talk. They're going to have to decide that this is in their strategic interest. But presenting some specifics could lead Coney to see the solution at the end of the road. Now, as I said, the President has indicated a great deal of flexibility in what he's prepared to provide for Joseph Kony. I mean, the package could include any number of things. We can visualize them. He could reside in another part of Uganda so as not to antagonize or provoke the local population in the north where he's done so much damage. It could involve a sizable security detail, a house, and protection from prosecution, which of course will be very antithetical to what the ICC is trying to do. But that, if that's the price of peace, then many people would judge that to be worthwhile. And most importantly, I think, again, just to reinforce this point, President Museveni has indicated that these issues remain open for Kony to come back and make his own proposal. And once these requirements are made known, negotiations could be concluded rather swiftly. Now, just one word on U.S. policy. I think the U.S. continues not to fulfill its important potential for supporting the peace process. It has a major role to play in it, and now that it has become part of the quartet of countries supporting the mediation, the British, the Dutch, the Norwegians now, and the U.S., more direct engagement from Washington with President Museveni through the naming of some kind of an envoy or whatever word they want to use would focus U.S. efforts on supporting the peace process in addition to the many other important bilateral issues that we have with the Ugandans. This would provide President Museveni with a peace partner with whom he can strategize externally and ensure, I think, more consistency, which is needed from State House in terms of message, in terms of the commitment, and more U.S. public statements in addition to a body coming from Washington sometimes. More U.S. public statements in support of the peace process would have a positive impact, I'm quite sure, on Joseph Kony and his confidence in the outcome of any kind of a process. There's much that can and should be done to contribute to peace in northern Uganda now that the international community can contribute to. And as one of the top former LRA officials told me, he said, quote, "The last step in dealing with a madman is to kill him." Now there are many things that can be done rather than relying on that very uncertain outcome in northern Uganda. And the international community, along with the Ugandan government, should be working overtime on all of these things. Thanks.
Thank you, John. As usual, very illuminating and succinct and extraordinarily well informed. Before we ask John questions, I want to turn to our other presenter, Gilbert Khadiagala, who is Associate Professor at SAIS at Johns Hopkins and Acting Director of the African Studies program there, has been an important observer and analyst of mediation efforts and peacemaking, particularly in East Africa, partially supported by a grant from USIP. He's finishing up a manuscript called Mediators or Meddlers, which deals with peacemaking in several of the countries of Eastern and Central Africa. Gilbert?
Thank you, David. When Howard asked me to come to this panel, I thought we had agreed that I was going to be a discussant. And then when I saw the announcement, it said I'm supposed to talk about the role of international donors in the process. I'm glad to share the same platform with John, a friend of mine. Very tough act to follow because John has all the nice details about the process. Let me, from the outset, state that, in fact, I want to take a very skeptical view of the peace process in northern Uganda. And I proceed, in fact, from the very simple assumption that there is no peace process in place. Rather, what is in place is the appearance of a peace process, the illusion of movement to legitimize an uneasy and an asymmetrical military stalemate. The illusion of movement to sustain a status quo that the Museveni government, in fact, can live with. I'm convinced that the government has thus far tolerated the Betty Bigombe talks, primarily to keep donors at bay. If therefore the talks are a charade to sustain the appearance of progress in the conflict and to mollify donors, there is really no meaningful additional role for international actors, particularly as mediators in this conflict. I think donors have already done enough to dramatize the significance of a peaceful approach to the conflict. I think any additional donor engagement merely contributes to the procrastination of the parties on the ground. Why do I say this? The current optimism about a peace process that started last year stemmed from essentially two factors. The first one being the peace agreement in the southern Sudan that radically changed the military dynamic in the war against the LRA. But I think we should also note that this was not a very new development, since the LRA was already weakened by the action of the Sudanese government, in fact, to afford the Ugandan government opportunities to pursue the LRA into southern Sudan. So that Operation Iron Fist has been in place for almost 2 years, at least by the time we began talking about a weakened LRA. Operation Iron Fist had been in place for 2 years. So this was not really new. I think the second component was external pressure on the Ugandan government. especially Jan Egeland's persistence in embarrassing the Museveni government. Egeland has been persistent, has been instrumental in internationalizing the northern Ugandan problem. While the Ugandan government may not be pleased that the problem is discussed in the halls of the UN Security Council, Egeland has pushed the diplomatic envelope and refocused attention to the humanitarian component of the conflict. But again here, I think we should not exaggerate the novelty of international pressures on the Museveni government. Several voices from within Uganda, international NGOs, and the international community have previously made the same point that Egeland began to make last year. The message, therefore, has all been out there, that there can be no embarrassment to the Museveni government, that the LRA insurgency is an irritant. It demonstrates the government's incapacity to tame the North, to win the hearts and minds of the Acholis and the rest of the community. But the conflict also continually has demonstrated the government's incapacity in essentially dealing with the insurgency. So what did the confluence of these two events, supposedly military weakness of the LRA and international pressures, bring about? I think what these two things did was they allowed Betty Bigombe to re-enter the conflict as a mediator, wearing three hats. The first hat as an Acholi, the second hat as a previous mediator in the conflict. But more importantly, Betty has always had very sustained engagement, phone calls with Bigombe, with Konyi beyond her service in government. Finally, Betty is wearing a tentative and a very tenuous international hat, where she's been able, in fact, to draw in some international actors who are coalesced around her process. The Bigombe negotiations began initially with very lukewarm government support, understandably, because the LRA was at its weakest and most vulnerable. In fact, the initial feeling within government was, why negotiate when Konyi is losing control over his dwindling soldiers? The Bigombe initiative, however, generated a momentum that a weakened LRA essentially could latch on. And so essentially, the LRA was suing for peace and probably wanted, and probably still wants, a soft landing that John is talking about. When the government announced the participation of Minister Uganda in the talks had reached a stage where the government had to demonstrate some semblance of interest in the negotiations, lest it alienates the donors, who are quickly, in fact, jumping on the Bigombe bandwagon. The government's significant concession last December was the limited ceasefire that essentially allowed the LRA, some of the rebels, to surrender and take advantage of the long-standing amnesty. And I think John explains very well, the ceasefire was very restricted to very specific areas where Bigombe and her team could meet the LRA while permitting the war to continue in other areas. So what we find was that there was a parallel process of ceasefire punctuated by inevitably war. Punctuated by war that inevitably produced confusion. And it is this confusion that, in fact, doomed the mediation early this year when the government refused to renew the ceasefire. So when he justified the government's failure to renew the ceasefire, Defense Minister Mbabazi announced in Parliament that the war was coming to an end, that the government had killed more than 1,000 rebels, and that there were only 300 to 400 rebels remaining. And Museveni, in fact, has reiterated the same message since January, the message that simply says, the LRA has been completely defeated, and its remnants are just simply fugitives, whom he argues we are capturing by the day. So what did the Bigombe Initiative achieve? I think these talks need to be accurately read as pre-negotiations. The key item largely being trying to arrive at a comprehensive ceasefire prior to substantive discussion on the terms of the agreement or a formula. So Bigombe has been trying to sell a memo of understanding to Konyi that essentially commits him to a ceasefire and not much else. There is no indication of the terms of a settlement or a formula for negotiations. I think Bigombe's biggest achievement has been to allow the LRA commanders to surrender. And I think this is the greatest achievement, which ironically has emboldened the government in its commitment to a military outcome. And the point being very simple: why negotiate with a movement that is monthly losing its commanders? The surrenders have also widened the gap within the LRA between, of course, essentially the moderates and the refuseniks, so that more moderates are now wanting opportunities to surrender, as the refuseniks, Konyi and Oti, in fact, wait it out. So where, in my reading, are we now in the conflict? I think to get an accurate picture of the current situation, we have to begin from the basic premise that the government is sufficiently distracted by constitutional changes and donor pressures on other fronts to pay that much attention to the conflict in the north. And that is why there is a stalemate and a status quo that is tolerable. If the military can win a quick victory over the LRA, maybe over the 300, 400, the government will take it. If not, the situation continued to drag on, as it has always done. But Museveni was confronted with a memorandum from Gulu University students 2 months ago, who are demanding a comprehensive ceasefire and third-party-led negotiations. And his response was very simple: let Betty Bigombe continue with the talks, as we, the government, will continue with the military means. And that's a public statement. And the government's military fortunes have been boosted by the renewed collaboration between the Sudanese army and the UPDF. And Garang was in Kampala in January, and he said, we'll flush out the LRA. So that is essentially strengthening the military dimension to the conflict. This is not the appropriate moment for a government that has never mastered the political will to resolve the northern conflict. If it has not paid much attention to the conflict before, it will not do it when it is preoccupied with other questions. And this is the argument that I'm putting across, that simply says the North is not as important in the current political calculus. Secondly, I think the government is aware that the long-term challenge of managing the northern conflict hinges on significant costs of reconstruction that it will have to bear. Although it may be easier to win the war against the LRA, I think there are enormous problems of translating such victory into concrete political and economic commitments that would reverse the legacy of northern marginalization and decay. This is the argument that I'm putting across as the fear of peace argument. Meanwhile, donors are reading Bigombe's initiatives purely in technical terms. The mediation needs to be boosted, made more robust. There needs to be more international actors to reassure the LRA. We should add a British colonel on the mediation. Get a Norwegian co-mediator so that Konyi will be more reassured. get the Troika to play the role of the friends of Betty Bigombe, to put more pressure on the government to be more serious about the negotiations. What has been the government's response to these new pressures? First, it accuses the EU of fueling the conflict by promoting peace instead of a military solution. And that's also in the public domain. Secondly, Museveni, in his Labor Day speech, claims donors are complicit in what he calls terrorism in the North because they have prevented him from spending as much as he wants on the military budget. What is therefore emerging from my perspective between the government and donors over the northern conflict is a dialogue of the deaf. In January, there was an EU delegation in Kampala led by Patrick Mazimhaka talking about the AU said we can help. This is a conflict that you should admit you can't manage. What kind of help should we give you? Museveni's response was, yes, I'll only accept AU mediation if Bigombe's talks fail. Now everybody knows that the Bigombe talks are limping. Why hasn't the government engaged the AU? That's my question here. So therefore, on the margin of the conflict, what is emerging is the other smaller conflict as to whether the ICC should indict Kony and his colleagues for war crimes. I think this is a sideshow to the negotiations that are not going anywhere. But fortunately, it has elicited very interesting debate, I think, within Acholiland. And people, a bulk of the people talking about this will be, to quote the Acholi King chief, the last nail in the coffin of a fragile peace process. So I think what I'm reading is that an ICC very desperate for some early successes to vindicate its existence, simply latching on to this conflict and playing, I would argue in this case, more of a spoiler role. Does an indictment that makes the LRA more or less, does it make the LRA more or less willing to engage the government? What is the point of an indictment that you cannot immediately, when you cannot immediately arrest the culprits? I think there is a compromise that is emerging within the ICC, which is an interesting compromise where Moreno Ocampo says, we'll stop, but maybe not close the case, we can wait. The stalemate to me, therefore, is an asymmetrical stalemate. The rebels are succeeding only by remaining military irritants, while the government is losing little except in civilian goodwill. I think Kony is running out of hiding places, and I think he may have no incentives now to negotiate, perhaps with the expectations that he has nothing to lose, with his forces in disarray. In conclusion, let me outline a very simple approach to how I see the conflict being resolved, notwithstanding what my friend John talked about here. There is a simple point about ownership of the process, government ownership of the conflict. Museveni has been in Gulu so many times. I've never heard him publicly invite Kony into negotiations. I've only heard him invite Kony to surrender, take advantage of the 2000 amnesty. I think if he went to Gulu and made this boldest move for peace in northern Uganda, it would win him a lot of support. He would lose nothing, even if Kony doesn't reciprocate. And even if Kony doesn't reciprocate, why not extend a serious olive branch to the remaining commanders in northern Uganda? How much control does Kony have over his diminishing forces anyway? I don't believe that he still has this biblical sway over his forces as he previously claimed. And if, as the Uganda government claims, he has been confined to southern Uganda, he can't communicate with his forces, then he's not in charge of his troops. So the people they should be negotiating with are not really Kony, but the people in northern Uganda who are causing trouble. I think the bigger question is, why can't the military find him? If they can find him to give him a new satellite phone, why can't they give him surrender terms or a golden parachute out of the drudgery of southern Sudan? I think when the minister was here 2 weeks ago, he said Museveni had bought a satellite phone and asked Betty to give it to Kony. And my reaction to that was, how does one trivialize a monumental humanitarian crisis if the debate would be revolved around the question of whether Kony has a working satellite phone? I think we need to be more serious than this. As part of the ownership of the problem, Museveni would set up camp in Gulu or Kitgum until the nearly 2 million people in IDP camps begin to return home. Ownership, I think, here would entail treating the North as a disaster zone. And this is the demand that MPs in Parliament made a while ago, before their demands were rubbished, in fact, by the NRM. I think making the North owning that problem would force the government to mobilize national resources towards that objective. This would be a more fruitful approach to the conflict, I think, than the current game of whether we need a ceasefire, who should be the mediator, what should the role of international actors be. And finally, therefore, my point is the efforts and energies of the international community, in fact, should be spared to deal with the enormous post-conflict reconstruction problems of northern Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert, for a different point of view and a challenge. I want to give, before I open it up for discussion, I want to give John a chance to respond to some of your points. I want to pick up on one of Gilbert's points, particular interest to me, and that's whether the government does have a commitment to a long-term effort of countering the marginalization of Acholi land and providing the kind of long-term development assistance and empowerment that's required to reintegrate Acholi land back into Uganda. But John, why don't you respond to Gilbert?
Well, to pick up on that point, I think where Gilbert and I would come together is that whether or not this particular mediation effort has legs enough to get across the finish line, beyond that, there has to be a broader effort. And I referred at the beginning to sort of the need for a more comprehensive peace strategy that's clear and identifiable and backed by resources, that's a partnership between the government and the international donors. Mediation is one part of conflict resolution and reconciliation in the North. But there are many other elements. I think if I can go through them very quickly, I think the elements, and Gilbert, if you have additions or subtractions, it'd be really interesting to hear yours, is the military strategy is in all of its guises. First, that the military efforts be more focused, less indiscriminate. Over the last year, we've seen improvement in that regard because of the reconnaissance plane and the attack helicopters being able to locate individual units more quickly and respond to sightings of LRA more quickly. So they, rather than the sort of very indiscriminate efforts, ground-based efforts in the past, there is a little bit better targeting that goes on, but that has to be improved. Human rights abuses have to be addressed, reduced and punished, and a larger sort of counterinsurgency strategy which involves more direct civil military relations with local populations. These are things that could be part and parcel of a larger strategy for peace. The reintegration effort, I think, is a fundamentally important part of an overall peace strategy. Right now, you talk to these LRA commanders, and most of them will say, you know, if there was a more clear package that the World Bank and the government of Uganda and the donors provided to people coming out, to the LRA coming out, that this would very quickly accelerate the number of LRA that come out, whether you get a peace deal or not. The World Bank and the Amnesty Commission, the Ugandan government took, whatever it's been, 2 years since they first announced that they were putting this package together, and they just now, in this month, during the last month, have started to give packages to LRA that have come out of the bush. That, I think, and they're very meager packages, as they always are in these kinds of things, and I think that a very specific initiative focused particularly on education, like the kid we listened to and everyone else you talk to, that education would have a very direct pull factor on getting people out of the bush and, again, eroding and reducing the core capacities of the LRA to do damage in the north. Justice and accountability are all part of this as well, of a larger strategy. The ICC is one component that is both a contributor to potential for resolution, but also one that in the short term could be very destabilizing, and that has to be factored into the overall effort. Reconciliation, putting the reconciliation component into the overall strategy is crucially important. All of us have heard about the traditional ceremonies and rituals that are performed as efforts to bring reconciliation among communities in the Acholi land, and a great deal of effort is being expended. A lot of money is going towards reconciliation in the north, but very little of it is, if you go to the displaced camps, very little of it is evident, and as is always the case in these kinds of situations. So much is spent on people going to conferences and workshops and stuff rather than helping to support real reconciliation efforts on the ground in the camps and the villages. And I think a lot more could be done in that regard that would accelerate moving forward. And then ultimately, hearts and minds. I mean, it's how is governance, which is getting down to the core of your question, how the quality of governance in the north, taking visible steps on the part of the government to have top-level managers come in and handle water, electricity, and other elements of the basic public works, public services. These are visible manifestations of government commitment to the welfare of the people in the north that are missing, that people perceive to be missing in the north. Whether it is missing or not, it's the perception that is so important. And so if you put all these elements together into a larger package, you have a peace strategy. So mediation is one of those components, but there are many others that I think could contribute to peace. And I think that goes in part to address some of what Gilbert's critiques are of the current effort, which is that that mediation, all the eggs can't be put in that basket. I mean, there just is too many. That then puts the onus of responsibility on whether there's peace or not in the hands of Joseph Kony, and it's simply too unpredictable to do that solely. So you have to, I think, diversify risk and put forth a broader sort of vision and concept. And again, in my discussions with the president, there is no resistance to this. It's just not yet sort of fully articulated. There are lots of different plans and ideas floating around, but it's not clear and crystal clear. Again, most importantly, to the people of the north, that peace is the ultimate objective of the government in Kampala.
Ambassador, did you want to make a contribution to this discussion? We'll bring a microphone to you. Unless you want to come up here, you're welcome to come up.
Yeah, I would like to do that. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for being here and for being interested in Uganda and being interested in northern Uganda in particular. I'm delighted to see all of you. Thank you, John, and thank you, Gilbert. Actually, my brother Gilbert just left me completely confused as to where does he belong in this conflict, because he doesn't seem to understand that there has been terrorism in northern Uganda. He seems to see it as a conflict, and he talks about marginalization, and I thank you because you have given me an opportunity, and I'll talk about the marginalization of northern Uganda in particular. But let me say that you really do not need to love President Museveni or the Uganda government to do the kind of atrocities that have been committed, because we all know that actually these atrocities have really not, it has not been a conflict between LRA and UPDF, the Uganda army. It has been the LRA committing untold atrocities against innocent, mainly children. Now, how does anybody explain that because I hate a government, I'm going to kill my children? It just leaves me completely confused. And for those who do not know, as a matter of fact, Lango is part of northern Uganda, and it is not known to be in love with government, but they have said no to Kony. They have said no to Erare. He tried. He went there, and they flushed him out. He went to West Nile, which is another part of northern Uganda, where Idi Amin came from, and they flushed him out. They said no. He went to Teso. They said no. So it just baffles me. How come the Acholi, and I'm sorry to use that general, which I think is not fair to generalize, that they have tolerated him, and yet he's killing their children. I think that is a question that should be in the mind of all of you. Because, when I hear this kind of debate trying to politicize really what is a humanitarian tragedy, what is, something that is really difficult to explain, because I just do not understand how that can happen. I know that during the genocide in Rwanda, that women even killed their own children because their fathers were Hutus. Those are very rare, and to me, they are still very unexplainable, because you do not really need to love the other person in order to care for a child. So the arguments, I really find them very, very unproductive, and I don't know whether academic, but they don't make much sense. The marginalization of northern Uganda is not actually a product of the NRM government. For those who do not know the history of Uganda, Uganda was colonized by Britain, and the colonial rule was, Uganda was divided in three parts mainly: the north, the south, and the northeast. South was more favored. North was a reservoir of the army. And the army, mainly because they say they were stout, they were strong, they fitted to serve in the army. The northeast, Karamoja, which up to date still has problems. Obviously, those are problems that had to be dealt with at independence if Uganda was going to move as a one united country. Unfortunately, the first leader really that we had was from the north, Milton Obote. He did not rectify that, those distortions. Instead, he took advantage of them. And actually, that is how Idi Amin came to power. And eventually, he came back, committed the same mistakes that overthrew him, because he was overthrown twice by armies that were actually mainly from the north. So actually, President Museveni is the first leader from the south that actually has committed himself. From the very beginning, we had a program for the reconstruction of northern Uganda, which was being supported by the World Bank. You can check this out. It is not fake, it is real. Because President Museveni realized that the future of nation building in Uganda and of reconciliation in Uganda depended on actually uplifting northern Uganda. And the reason why President Museveni has spent so much time, he probably forgot to tell you that there was a time for 6 months he was in northern Uganda, staying in a barracks. A Ugandan barracks is not a palace, I can assure you. And he was staying there because he was looking for peace. So how do you explain, therefore, what has been happening in Acholi, which I have said is very difficult to explain? Really, for me, I think that we see lack of leadership, lack of even a vision, because the conflict in the so-called conflict, which is really terrorism of RRA, could have been really, he would have tried, of course, but at least it could have been resolved much earlier, like it has been resolved in Teso with the local leadership, in Lila, the MP, Honorable Cecilia Gwal, whom everybody knows is UPC, is not NRM, but she rejected Connie. And of course we know very well that Connie is not educated, but he has been facilitated. He has been facilitated by some people from the same community, facilitated basically to kill their own children. And so I just want to assure all of you that Uganda government is very committed. Is very committed to the development of northern Uganda. For us, it is in the interests of Uganda for so many reasons. One, the economy that we talk about, that everybody has heard, if it had been including northern Uganda, we would probably be in 2 digits, because northern Uganda, and Acholi in particular, has been, more or less like a drain. So if they were contributing, just even if you looked at it from an purely economical point of view, it would be interesting for us. And it would be interesting for us because we're expanding. It is, but most importantly, it is our people who are dying. I feel more Acholi than many of the Acholis who have been killing these children, because I hurt when I see these children being, in fact, I get very emotional talking about northern Uganda, because it basically involves children, and I'm a mother. So I thank you very much for the interest you have taken. I thank you, John. You've done a good job. I thank my friend Betty, who has tirelessly continued to look for peace. For your information, President Museveni has a track record, actually, of talking to his enemies, even those who have tried to kill him. Yeah, if you went into the track record, you will see it is there. He has negotiated. RRA is not the only rebel, so-called rebel group that has been in Uganda. We have had many, and many of them he has managed to make peace with them. He has given them, as a matter of fact. We never pursued Idi Amin in Saudi Arabia. We left him because it was not priority for us. Our priority was to rebuild our country. And I believe that, although it is really very, very hard to forgive Connie, but for the sake of rebuilding our country, for the sake of our future, which obviously is more important than the past, we can even do that. So, and as soon as all is done, I would like to invite all of you to come join us in rebuilding northern Uganda and Uganda as a whole. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Are there other points or questions? Identify yourself, please.
My name is Stephen Most, and I work for the Brookings Institution University of Bern project on internal displacement. And I want to thank the panelists for sharing with us today, and also for the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing this event. My question is, we've heard a lot about the internal displacement issue and crisis in Uganda. My question is, in what way, or to what extent and in what ways, are IDPs being integrated into the peace processes in Uganda?
John, you want to just answer one by one? Well, why don't we actually have about 10 or 15 minutes, so why don't we take about 4 questions and then let the panelists answer them all, and we'll finish. Yes, back there.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Charles Bongomin. Basically, I come from Gulu. I'm here as a graduate student of Peace International international peace and conflict resolution. It's very absurd for all these years that now we are trying to draw attention, trying to look at how we can try to solve the northern Uganda conflict. And with this respect, I would just want to make a very brief comment in trying to make history straight, because I know this is not a political debate, so we should not mix politics with what's happening right now back home. And and I want to make this very clear that no actually tolerated coin or does not tolerate coin. We have never facilitated coin. If we supported coin, the trend of conflict would have been so different right now. But now we are trying to look at ways of how we can bring peace in northern Uganda. I've worked for actually religious peace initiative for 3 years in trying to find a conflict resolution in the northern question. Now, with that respect, I'd like to have a brief question to all the panelists with what you have really brought forward. And I've noted, you have said that the president does not have the will, according to Gilbert. And according to John, you say the president is flexible right now. Now, with that kind of flexibility and lack of political will in trying to solve the northern Uganda question, will the conflict end? And if so, will the peace be sustainable? Because there's no commitment, it does not reflect the national interest. So these are some of the questions I wanted to pass across.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take two more. Yes.
Thank you. I just would like to, my name is Salah Al-Junaidi, I'm from Sudan Embassy. I would like just to comment for two points in the beginning of the presentation of John Prendergast. He started by stating that Sudan is supporting the LRA and ended by a call for international pressure on Sudan on this particular regard. We know the conclusion that he's always calling for international pressure on the government of Sudan, which is a ready-made label, but in this particular case, I see it rather obvious, rather awkward, in a sense that the statements coming from the Ugandan official government, President Museveni, Minister of Defense, are commending the cooperation of Sudan. And the reality on the ground, since the end of the conflict in southern Sudan, the government is not, troops are, we have a peace there, there are no military operations, and all these things. We went to the extent that, Sudan's government cooperation went to the extent that with the Ugandan government to allow the Ugandan military forces to enter and to operate inside Sudan, which I think something, cooperation to this extent, none of the countries in the region have done something like this, and very surprisingly to call for international pressure on Sudan on this particular regard, and we are allowing Ugandan forces to operate from Sudan. We are cooperating, and we have been commended by the official from the government of Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question, yes.
I'm Rahel Otieno. I work for the Institute of Development Studies, but I'm here on holiday. I just wanted to sort of inquire about two things. If there's been any coverage or exposure given to the gendered roles or women's roles in peace building and mediation and reconstruction, and if any of the panelists could comment on that a little bit. Thank you.
Okay. John and Gilbert? I might comment on the last one, but go ahead with
I think on the gender role, it's very clear in this case that Betty has been very persistent. She's been in this conflict. She's been involved in this conflict for quite a while, and she draws on a lot of Acholi energy, the structures within Acholi and the religious leaders and so on. So I think there is an attempt to get people previously marginalized in these kinds of processes to be involved. Immediate, I think Betty's role is a symbol of that. The IDP question, I think, needs to be treated in the way I think John had tried to answer, that there are two, or there should be two things going on. There should be attempts to stop the war, But I think the more formidable problem to me is the reconstruction beyond the war. My reading of the conflict is that we are getting there, and I don't know whether we'll get there through peaceful means. My inclination is to think that Konyi is sufficiently isolated, sufficiently weak, that I think what the government may be waiting for is essentially for more time, probably to effect a military solution. But I think if you read that as a premise, therefore, that at least a conflict, that there is a ray of light there, we just don't know how to get to the end. Then the question becomes, how does one think about reconstruction? And I think the ambassador, this is what I was trying to say. I'm saying that it will require considerable resources, considerable engagement for the Ugandan government and international actors in general, I think, in the reconstruction process. And so I'm not putting a conspiratorial point here that the government is afraid of reconstruction, but I'm just saying that's a much more difficult job to do than essentially trying to get Konyi back into the formula. That's my point. That we need to be thinking about the bigger issue of reconstruction. And Oxfam, in fact, I think came up with a report not too long ago. And Oxfam was saying, we're already beginning to see you people focusing too much on post-conflict reconstruction. You should be focusing on the problem itself. And I can understand that, because the conflict needs to be resolved before we talk about post-conflict reconstruction. So I think IDPs, my problem is that there's been a lot of silence on the other problems. And that's why I'm talking about a bold initiative that simply says, this is a national crisis. It cannot fester on for long. It has been festering for 19 years. And this is the point I was making about there has been lack of acknowledgement of the enormity of the problem. And we need some political move here. We need some, we need leadership in a broader sense. I think that's pretty much.
Okay, John.
In order of the questions on the question from Stephen on the IDP's involvement in the peace process, I mean, I've just personally witnessed over the last few months going out and spending a lot of time with their Betty Bigambe meets nonstop with northern Ugandan residents. She goes out to the camps, and there's a very concerted effort. And Dr. Rugunda, when he's involved, and other members of the government who have been supportive of Betty, do the same. And I think that there's a real effort to try to get some form of involvement and participation by local community. Second sort of area where you could look at local community participation is through this Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative that Charles mentioned. They really represent sort of the cry of the people, as it were. This effort to try to the church, the religious groups trying to be directly involved and supportive of the peace effort, I think is a reflection of that. And most of their, of course, constituencies are in the camps. And then thirdly, in terms of the IDPs, and their role in the peace effort is the reconciliation. I think that's going to be the biggest arena in which local people are going to be involved in longer-term peace efforts, as more and more effort is being expended to try to integrate these traditional reconciliation processes into a larger framework. We're going to see more and more, I think, effort on the part of these local communities to try to undertake the kinds of activities necessary to ensure that returning LRA members can go back to local communities, that intercommunal differences are going to be addressed over time, and some of the other sort of internal divisions that plague northern Uganda will be at least acknowledged and looked at in the context of these local processes. On this point that you're making about Noacholi facilitating Cone and the LRA, there certainly have been collaborators, but in the vast majority, I would strongly agree with you, vast majority of Acholi people recoil in horror regarding the LRA. I mean, there's no connection to these to the average person and the LRA. They live in terror, and you can go throughout history and look at societies who have been terrorized by a particular group, and they cooperate to some degree with that group because of the repercussions if they don't. The power imbalance is stunning of those between those with guns and those that don't have them in the North, and it's hard to justify sort of a view that would see it any other way. You asked about the flexibility that, given that if what I'm saying is correct, that President Museveni is demonstrating some flexibility, or at least acknowledging some flexibility in his position. Would the conflict end? Would peace be sustainable? Now, I think, as the ambassador said, the government of Uganda since 1986 has had a track record of integrating former rebel groups into the government, of undertaking all the kinds of DDR and military integration steps that are necessary to ensure the security of people who decide to lay down their arms. There's a long track record of that, given that Uganda has such a difficult history pre-86 of all these rebel movements that pre-existed the Museveni government. And I think that track record is, at least stands to, and as the ambassador invited people to look at, it's worth looking at, because those deals that were cut with some of these other rebel leaders will influence directly the calculations of Joseph Kony. I think, and the other part of the flip side of your question, though, in terms of the interest, I think you're trying to get at the interest of the government, whether the government ultimately has a strategic interest in peace in the North. And I think that's a fair question. I think 5 years ago, I think a lot of people in northern Uganda and abroad would have felt that, in fact, maybe there isn't, because of the military corruption, particularly the corruption in the military. It was a very open question. But I think that we've seen a very aggressive move since Mbabazi became defense minister, to try to address some of these things, the ghost soldier issues, the procurement scandals that are a thing of the past. There's still a lot of problems there, but it appears to me that there is a decision been made in Kampala that's got to be addressed, because it did in fact create a disincentive for peace in the North. And I think that the long-term strategic interest of the government now is in fact in the peace process, whether it's solely because it's embarrassing to the government to continue to make these statements that there's only 300 rebels every 3 months. They make this statement, and there's clearly way more than 300 rebels, and that's been obvious to everyone for a long time. So whether it's embarrassment that leads to a strategic decision to end this insurgency, or whether it's a true desire to see, whatever the motivation, I don't care about motivations when you're dealing with foreign policy. It's at the end of the day, are they going to step up or not? And my view is, in the context of what it's going to take to get Joseph Kony to agree to a peace deal, it's not a lot. And I think that the current government in Kampala is perfectly willing to accommodate it. The question is, will he come in? Or are the fears and paranoias too significant an obstacle for him to say, okay, let's see whether we can get a deal done? In terms of our friends from the Sudan embassy and their concerns, I think we've seen a lot of evidence lately that the resupply routes that existed before, as you say, have been ended. However, there continue to be persistent reports from eyewitnesses on the ground in southern Sudan that say that resupply continues. I agree with you. The Ugandan government has been, in fact, your strongest ally in your statement by saying no, publicly saying that the Sudan government has ended its support for the LRA. But I think that the number of eyewitness reports which continue to come in, and military analysts from a number of governments who have embassies both in Khartoum and Kampala and travel regularly up there, have concerns about continuing support. Now, I've heard many people from the Khartoum side of the fence say, well, that may be the case, but it's local level complicity, that there are certain local commanders in southern Sudan that have had long-standing relationships on the part of the government of Sudan with these guys in the LRA and within military intelligence and within the Sudan army. And I just find it hard to believe that those relationships could continue without top-level support. And it just concerns me as I look at the spoilers that exist for the implementation of the peace deal in Southern Sudan and the very difficult 6 years ahead of that Southern Sudan has ahead of itself, with elections coming in 3 years and a referendum in 6 years. I find it hard to believe that the Sudan government would let go of such an important tool for destabilizing the South, but that's my personal view. And I have no direct, concrete evidence that the government of Sudan continues to provide assistance, but I do believe that they will, if necessary, to maintain their own strategic interests in Southern Sudan. Finally, on the women's role in peace building, I think Gilbert's answer is I mean, it is the most extraordinary example of a woman-led peace process in Africa we have to date. However, there are other levels to sort of gender involvement, to women's involvement in the peace process. There are local groups, civil society groups who have integrated women into their efforts to do this reconciliation effort, part of XLRA, members who are going to local communities in the IDP camps and telling their stories and talking about how local reintegration could occur. I think this is a specific example, and women are part of that, who were former abductees. I think that's a specific example of how women can have been participating directly in the peace process. It's very encouraging. People listen to their stories and they respond to them very, very emotionally, to hear these stories told by their neighbors. As always, there's a lot more that could be done if more resources were made available, if attitudes were widened. But I think that Uganda is ahead of the curve in terms of gender involvement, in terms of gender balance in the peacemaking process.
I want to thank you all for joining us today. On your behalf, I want to thank John and Gilbert and the ambassador for presenting and leading a very stimulating discussion. Thank you. It was great. It was great. You getting a report out soon on this?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
The usual editing, ICG editing process.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Good to meet you. Yeah, good.
A lot of stuff going on. I still want to catch up.
Yes, please.
Are you ready? Next month? Is that?
Next week I'm gone, but then I'll be back, and then end of July.
First half of July.
Crazy.
did you get what about like international relations? You know, you can look at international relations and then you focus on so you can look at it that's focus on West Africa.
But I mean, 2 years earlier, that didn't bother them. Oh yeah, I can believe that. No, the chart was developing the selfish project.
Yeah, well, I guess back.
You're very generous.
No, you didn't. But even like this, I had to cover something this morning just so I could cover this right now. It's like a battle.
I was supposed to be there.
I like to stay inside.
Call me.
Okay.
Right. That's when I really hope to.
Thank you very much.
what I wanted to do is just to reinforce myself in building capacity. And my work now is with humanitarian response to destruction, democracy movements, but if you're not aware of it, you need to be. And I'd like to organize for my colleagues to come by and just. What's your schedule look like for the next sort of 22 weeks? You're here in town.